I work for Promoting Enduring Peace, which put up that incendiary banner, and also the Middle East Crisis Committee, which does the TV show The Struggle. And I'm going to put a plug in that since I have the floor. We've been doing that since 2003, 747 weekly TV programs, and you could see it at thestruggle.org. Our panel is called the Red-Brown Alliances, Fake News and Genocide Deniers. To sum it up in a few words, this panel is about combating lies, slanders, half-truths, fabrications, and defamation. Defamation against the people who rose up against all odds and who are undergoing mass murder and expulsion. And also now verbally an indecent assault by agents, collaborators, and fools. The term Red-Brown Alliance may be new to you. It's the observed overlap or outright collaboration between so-called red leftists whose concern with the victims of imperialism begins and ends with the U.S. and its allies, and the brown right forces who also complain about the U.S. empire on behalf of less powerful empires who are independent thugocracies. Fake news, well, it refers to the explosion of websites that avoid old-fashioned things like evidence, reliable sources, and logic in favor of prejudice and blind loyalty. Denialism is the religion of the conspiracists who put out the twists and turns of those who believe that the Syrians kill their children en masse to get world sympathy, who think anything is possible, who think that there are secret Hollywood-type video studios available in besieged areas where people are barely able to feed themselves, who believe that because the U.S. government does systematically lie, therefore anyone it criticizes must be telling the truth, and that the concerns of everyday people matter little compared to the great battles of geopolitics. Our speakers will delve into these dark corners and more. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, and we never really established an order, but Ahed's going to speak first. Ahed Festuk is an activist from Aleppo, Syria, who lived in the city's rebel-held side until late 2015, before seeking asylum in the United States in 2016. She was one of the pioneer women demonstrators, and when the war erupted, she worked as a paramedic on the front lines before joining organizations various to work relief and development, and a member of the ancillary staff of the Aleppo Local Council. She was contracted as a hostile environment and first aid trainer inside Aleppo. She works for the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. Ahed, why don't you begin?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to talk some about my experience as a Syrian activist. And if you have any question, I'm more than happy to answer them. Actually, in the beginning, before the revolution, people think that we have really like normal life and nothing there. And a lot of people say, oh, why you destroyed your country? Your country was amazing. And all that blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't. It seems to be right, but it wasn't. We used to go to the school wearing military suit. We used to praise to the Al-Assad God every morning when we go to school. Their three pictures were everywhere. The hospital, in bank, in our school, even in our book. We don't allow us to. We don't have any right to speak up or to ask why these three pictures everywhere. I mean, are they gods or what? If the police officer or like if the army came to your house to take any member of your family, you cannot ask, you cannot speak, you can even not ask them, where are you going to take them, to take my dad or my brother or whatever. When the Arab Spring Revolution started, I was just watching on the TV and crying. I don't know what should I do. I really hopeless, but I was trying to imagine maybe one day it's gonna be the same in Syria. During the Egyptian revolution, I was watching the demonstration in Tahrir Square and crying. And yeah, I couldn't actually sleep like for 4 weeks normally because I really want to do something during that time. So I did some research on the Facebook and I contact with a lot of friends and we start to organize peaceful demonstrations in the streets. That was in 2011 in Aleppo city. After like a few months, maybe after 8 or 9 months, we lost a lot of amazing people, including medical doctors and friends and students from the University of Aleppo. A few groups, it's not a few groups, it's like a few people who were in the protest. They decided to protect our demonstrations and they hold gun. After a few days, the regime started to bomb Aleppo and destroyed the buildings, the hospital, the schools, and start to spread that propaganda. I have terrorists and I'm fighting them, which is really not true. We were only Syrians at that time, like really no one from outside Syria. I felt really bad when I see that, and a lot of people from outside Syria, they started to believe the government news. After we have a lot of support from outside Syria, after the government start to say, yeah, I have terrorists, I have Islamic extremists, and I'm fighting them, a lot of people, they turn their back to us and they believe the propaganda that regime was trying to tell. I don't know, but we felt really like injustice, and we felt people really believe the stronger people, and we were really hopeless. They killed a lot of people, and the regime drove out like millions of people, and he's still in power. But yeah, anyway, I went to the hospital. I was volunteer there. I stayed volunteer until the beginning of at the end of 2012, when the hospital was bombed, and a lot of my friends were there. I couldn't actually provide medical aid anymore after the hospital was bombed. So I started to work as a humanitarian aid. So I worked with the Catholic Relief Service, with Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and other international organizations. In 2015, I felt really hopeless, and I felt I'm really useless there, and nothing gonna change after more than 5 years. So I decided to came here and to stay here. So I came. After a while, I felt really guilty to stay here and have electricity, water, food, while my friends there are struggling and they were under siege. So I tried to do something, so I started to connect with organizations who are involved here. And yeah, I became a volunteer here until last month. I started to work with Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. So yeah, and here we are.
Thank you. Want to go next? Next is John Ryman. He's a former recording secretary and expelled member of the Carpenters Local. I'll explain something about that. Local 713 in Hayward, California. He was I actually have it in my notes. He was expelled for leading a wildcat strike in 1999. He's a longtime socialist, has visited the workers' movement in various countries, including Venezuela and Pakistan. He was in Tahrir Square for several weeks during the Arab Spring, and he runs the blog site Oakland Socialist. John.
Thank you very much. So, sisters and brothers and comrades, those of you who were here in the previous session would know we had quite heated debate with some supposed revolutionaries who are so totally obsessed, I would have to say, with the issue of U.S. imperialism that they could not see the question of revolution right before their eyes. And they could not see the question of counter-revolution right before their eyes, which is what is the question in regards to Syria. And that is a perfect example of the issue that we are discussing here in this session, which is the question of the Red-Brown Alliance. And what I would like to do is go a little bit beyond just Syria, because that Red-Brown Alliance has a long history. It goes way back, actually, to the interwar period, and I think that we have to understand that history to understand what is happening now with the whole so-called peace movement and this Red-Brown Alliance. And it is not so much really, as I started reading it, I could see it's not so much really an alliance between red and brown as the brown, meaning the brown shirts, neo-fascists and outright fascists, cloaking themselves in different clothing and infiltrating the left and actually bringing layers of the left over to counter-revolution. It's something like, you could say, the invasion of the body snatchers. And in other words, it's a process. It's not just a one set relationship between two different distinct groups. And when you look at the whole issue, the whole process, the key distinction that really comes clear is the class question. That those of us on the left, we see the issue of the working class being the so-called progressive force in society, that it has to organize independently, and that it stands in opposition to the capitalist class. And the other side, there's a wing of them. We saw them in the Nazis with the Strasserites. We know that Mussolini came from out of the socialist movement. They might allude to that at times, but it's always in a confused manner. And so that for the so-called Reds in the Red-Brown Alliance, the sole question is U.S. imperialism. And the class question is completely left out. They don't see, for instance, the Syrian working class as any agency, as being the subject, not the object of history, and therefore what happens to them, the fact that they're getting the hell bombed out of them, that doesn't matter either. And we saw, if you go back a little bit in history, back in the interwar period, a layer of the fascist movement and of fascist ideologists such as Jean Thiriart in France. There's also a guy, Francis Parker Yockey from the United States, and they actually hung their hat on opposition to U.S. imperialism. But these were fascists, and as we saw in this morning's session, that's what these people hang their hats on. I'm not saying they were fascists, but you can see the overlap there. And what they proposed, the fascists, was, in actuality, support for European imperialism as opposed to U.S. imperialism. And then we go, if we fast forward, to the counter-revolution in Russia and in the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the reestablishment of capitalism there. And if you look at what happened in that, it was kind of the establishment of gangster capitalism. And as was mentioned by somebody here in the morning session, a lot of the people in the left are living in the past. They don't recognize that Russia is not only a capitalist state, but one of the most reactionary capitalist states or certainly in Europe. And 200 years earlier, well, in 1814, the Russian Tsar organized all the monarchist powers in Europe to fight against the progressive, the bourgeois democratic values. And Putin is playing a similar role now of bringing together all the reactionary, racist, chauvinist, and actually fascist forces in Europe. He's playing that role, and one of his foremost people in doing that is this guy, Alexander Dugin, who is in some ways similar to, you could say, he's like the Stephen Bannon of the Putin administration. And Dugin, even before the downfall of the Soviet Union, was going around meeting with all kinds of different Russian fascists. European fascists. And so you had, I mentioned this Holy Alliance in 1814. Well, 200 years later, Putin issued a similar call, and they had, for instance, in 2014, a conference of the families in Russia, organized by the Putin regime to establish Christian family values. And as he went on, he came to see the need for an ideological base, Putin did. And that ideological base was based on the Russian Orthodox Church and its calls for really values of the old old Russian feudalism. And I just want to emphasize this is directly related to what is happening in Syria, because who is the #1 backer of the Assad regime is this same Putin, without whom Assad would not have survived as long as he has. And another thing that this guy Dugin has been pushing is the so-called third way. And in other words, it's not a right or a left anymore. You see Bannon just the other day, when the new right-wing Italian regime took office, Bannon said the same thing. It's not a right and a left anymore. In other words, there's no class divisions in society is what they're really saying. And then in 2014, there was a key conference that was held against globalization in Russia. Dugin was connected with it, and all various fascist forces came to that conference. That included the Neo-Confederate League of the South, which is an openly racist group and really a fascist group here in the United States. Also the Republic of Texas, which is another fascist group. And I have to say, for myself, coming from back in the 70s and 80s, I feel a little funny talking about fascism, because back at that time, every damn body that you disagreed with. Nixon, Reagan, everybody else was a fascist. And it really was not true then, but it is a genuine force today. Anyway, who else appeared at that conference was a representative of the International Action Center, which is a front for the Workers' World Party, and also a representative of UNAC, which is probably the largest left-wing or supposed left-wing so-called peace coalition here in the United States. And they had no problems being at the same conference with these racist and fascist groups. Another development that I think has been of key importance has been the globalization of capitalism, which has, sorry, how much?
You got plenty.
Okay, but which has devastated the world's working class, but it's also not only economically, but also, you could say, politically or psychologically in this sense. And you know, and I would urge everybody in the room to read this article. The Guardian, the London Guardian newspaper, a couple of months ago, published an article called "The Demise of the Nation State." You can just, if you use those words, you can find it on Google. And they go into intimate detail. I don't have the time to give all the quotes, but they just say, look, what's happening is, with the spread of global capitalism, with the development of these forces of production that cannot be confined to just one particular nation, and with the internet and all of that, and how finance capital can just rip from one area of the world to another, and how that's not only devastated the living standards of the working class, but it has severely weakened actually the national borders and the nation states themselves. And as we know, capitalism was born, raised, reared, and nurtured politically on the existence of the nation states. And, you know, almost every worker, including workers that would even, a lot of them that would maybe be sympathetic to socialism, would identify themselves as, I'm an Italian, or I'm an American, or I'm a Belgian, or a Brazilian, or whatever. And now they see that that national identity is just crumbling before this power of finance capital ripping all around the world like a huge giant swarm of locusts. And in the absence of a mass socialist international working class movement, what's happening is workers all around the world now are yearning for a return to the good old days, to a time that's gone by that can never return. And we also see, incidentally, how the capitulation of social democracy has added to that, because they have been some of the foremost ones in pushing, in enforcing the austerity that finance capital demands. They've been some of the foremost ones in pushing that. That's why, for instance, in Italy, you had the Five Star Movement and the League, which is a semi-fascist group. The two of them, why they got, you know, are in office right now. And incidentally, I would also say that the Brexit vote was a very similar process in Britain just a couple of years earlier. So you've had the globalization of world capitalism, which vastly undermined the traditional powers of the national governments and so on. The capitulation of the traditional working class parties in Western Europe, and also the crisis in the former colonial world. And we must remember that the nation states in the former colonial world never had were never established in the same way and had the same credibility as they do in the advanced capitalist countries. You just look at Syria and that whole part of the world. How were those nation states established? Through the Sykes-Picot Accord, where the imperialist robbers went in there and said, okay, you get to plunder this part under the name of this country, and I'll get to plunder that part under the name of another country. And yes, now people might identify themselves as being this or that, you know, from this or that country, but we just have to remember that those nation states were created in a different way. So, and I also want to make some particular points about the left in the United States, which has somewhat different traditions from, because of the different traditions of the working class, has some different traditions from other parts of the world, and in particular other imperialist countries. And here, a lot of youth have entered into left politics through anti-government and anti-government intervention. And a lot of that lends itself to the propaganda of the far right. And it's no accident that a lot of the fascists here in this country, for instance, Richard Spencer, came into political activity as an anarchist. And there's a whole layer of others who were similar to that. And then you have this insane conspiracy theory stuff. We heard it about Syria, but the Sandy Hook school shooting was just a bunch of actors on TV. I mean, you talk about denialism and people who bury their heads in the sand, it's just insane. And so, and the left has responded to this confusion and has responded to this confusion by adapting to it. That is what these people from that small left sect, the internationalists so-called, that is what they are doing. And so I'd just like to say in conclusion that I think that we have a couple of important tasks. One is just to try to clarify what the hell is actually going on in Syria, and that it really is a matter of revolution or counter-revolution, and which side are you on that, to try to clarify that. And also, I think to try to clarify the class question, and from my point of view, I think that there is no way that we can do that without relating it to the class struggle here in the United States. And given that both the Republicans and the Democrats are big business parties that actually have supported Assad and similar types all throughout the world, that you have to link, and just like they support the employers here in this country and are based on that, that you have to link up the question with the struggle for a mass socialist working class party here in the United States. Thank you very much.
Next is going to be Jason Hicks. He's a member of the Transport Workers Union, Local 100, and the Democratic Socialists of America. And I would editorialize they're the biggest socialist group in the country. And I understand they're having an internal debate about Syria, and I certainly want to encourage that goes in the best direction. Jason Hicks.
Yeah, in that regard, the Democratic Socialists of America grew rapidly after the election of Trump. And in that sense, it reflects the confusion. I use the word hesitantly because it's been 8 years, so people should not be confused. But at the same time, objectively speaking, most individual leftists, it's not that they have worked out positions as Assadist, in my experience. They have been confused by the institutions of the left, the publications. So you have Jacobin to call them out in particular because for 4 years, I believe it was, there's a timeline. I think 4 years they did not publish a single Syrian revolutionary. Like, this is the most read leftist publication. Then they started to, and now they've stopped again. And they refused to publish a rebuttal to Assadist propaganda that they published after Trump's last airstrikes on the chemical weapons facilities. So this is the most read left publication, and it has been a haven for Assadist conspiracy theories. This is the left we have right now, whether we like it or not. And I think the response of the left, and what is the left, right? It's just a label. It can mean anything. But however one wants to define it, it is weak and it has failed on Syria. Like, not as necessarily every individual or every group, but just as, a broad thing. It has completely failed. So there are this growing red-brown alliance, and there's two key articles on that. One that's on Libcom, and one that's on, it was taken down under pressure, Alexander Reed Ross's article, or a series of articles that people can Google or ask us for the links. But that goes through like Marxists that are, so the main process is, I think, sort of these far-right forces infiltrating and manipulating the left, but there's also the party, like the Party for Socialism Liberation, is using this idea of being anti-imperialist to, if a fascist says they're anti-imperialist, they'll give them the platform and let them speak and, like, you know, normalize their views. So it is going both ways. And then there are the people that aren't, like, as far as in an organizational relationship with the far right, but are spreading far right views, like people that criticize the white helmets as being imperialist proxies or something. That is a fascist view, whether they are in alliance with fascists in any other way or have other fascists. It's like one of the most vile reactionary views to like slander first responders as legitimate military targets. Yeah. And so the idea that this exists on the left, they might be a minority, but they've been able to dominate the conversation. Like in the first panel, Shyam said it's like we're having the same conversation every year, and we are. Like, what the fuck? Like, I've tried to use the line on my comrades in the DSA, and not with much effect, but it might just be because I'm one person, that everything we're trying to do as leftists or in the DSA, people in Syria are doing under a vicious dictatorship and daily bombardment and seizures. There's women's centers, there's media centers, there's councils that are running society. So almost any issue you talk about at the left forum here, people are doing and have experience with, and they're not being listened to. Like, these are some of the only panels on Syria that aren't Assadist panels, but unfortunately we're focused on just like trying to still have this conversation after 8 years, when really it should be like half the panels here should be like people from the Quran Foundation, like reporting on their work and like getting support and sharing experiences, like people in the media centers like sharing tips and trading strategies. Like, that's what the left should be, right? Like, if it means anything, like if it has any meaning other than like an aesthetic subculture, like that is what we should be doing, but we're not there. And so we have to ask ourselves why that is. And I mean, one thing it's made me do is go back and reevaluate everything. So like, I was a new leftist in Mississippi, like very isolated in Mississippi in the early 2000s. And the Iraq War comes, and you're dealing with all this racist Islamophobic propaganda and opposing it. And I mean, I don't really blame myself because I was what I was, but it meant that there was a tendency to downplay, say, the criticism of Saddam in the left, because they didn't want to abet the U.S. invasion. So at the big anti-war marches, they didn't say have a conscious practice of giving, there were anti-war Iraqis, obviously, people that were anti-Saddam and anti-U.S. invasion. The anti-war marches should have given them great prominence. They should have educated people about Iraqi people, about the suppression of Saddam. It should have been an opportunity to build connections. That's a phrase Shyam used in the first panel that I think is important, building connections. It's not just about positions or theories, but if people had like an actual understanding and awareness of these different societies, these different peoples and their struggles, there wouldn't be the same basis for conspiracy propaganda, denialism, and this fake news stuff. It reflects while the narrative of these people is that there's an imperial propaganda machine, the reality is the imperial propaganda machine is anti-Muslim, Islamophobic war on terrorism, and they're playing into it. They're not hearing about the white helmets and what they're actually doing. They're not hearing about, they don't even know what the Quran Foundation is, which does women's centers and other good work in Syria. They don't actually know any of this. They don't know that protests are still happening in Syria. Everyone said, oh, the revolution happened, yes, but it was a month. Like, it's like the most mind-blowing thing that this is acceptable to talk about on the left. And this gives space to like actual fascist organizing in the left, which most leftists would say they're against, but their failure on Syria solidarity has created the space for this kind of infiltration in far-right reactionary movements. This is a key part, but isn't connected. Well, I'm just going to throw it out there. The second part of the panel title is fake news. And one thing Syria made me realize, too, is that there's this superficial critical thinking on the left that I played into, too. So if you share an article on Syria from the New York Times, people say, well, it's the New York Times. That's not a sufficient response. Like, that's not actual critical thinking. Like, you have to actually demonstrate what is wrong with the article. Versus if you share an article from Counterpunch that says bullshit, that's fine because it's a left publication. The fact is, if you read the New York Times and BuzzFeed and Wired Magazine, you'd have a better understanding of the Syrian Revolution than reading left publications. Like, it's just a fact. Like, BuzzFeed did better than Counterpunch and The Nation. The Nation's gotten better, but it did better than Jacobin. It did better than all these people that are created publications to be progressive. And this is just a tremendous failure, and that's partly relates to why I said for most individuals, they are just confused in the sense that they don't have bad positions per se, but they've been exposed to this left ecosystem and echo chamber and been poisoned against hearing these, like, what actually happened. And we have to confront that failure, and which leads me up to that. I think part of this is sort of, I guess, addressing myself most directly, is that a lot of the left default response is a polemic, which we need polemics. These people deserve every polemic they can get. But I think actually organizing, like having a perspective of like going door to door if possible, we're not at that point, we don't have enough support, but like introducing people to this information, like showing the documentaries on the White Helmet, Syria the Impossible Revolution, that documentary, sharing Syrian voices and centering them and creating a culture that exists on other issues. There's in the left, there's more of a culture now of, say, on an issue like racism, people feel rightly a problem if they're reading mostly white people talking about racism. But when it's Syria, it's like there is no such understanding or culture of like, what's wrong with me that I'm just reading Max Blumenthal writing about Syria? Like, no, people don't have that response. But we can, I think, help change that culture through like hard work of having these conversations and sharing this information. Let's see. I jumped around a bit, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion. Oh, another thing, I went back to the third part of the panel title is Genocide, Denialism. So there's a great website called Balkan Witness, and it makes clear there's been a long tendency on the left that relates to, well, stuff everyone's talked about, to be so emotionally centered on opposing the U.S. that one wants to downplay crimes of other people. And this was done a lot with the Balkans and with Milosevic and Chomsky, who's a darling of the left and has not partaken in some of the worst parts of Assadist propaganda, is friends with all these people. And like, there's a book that talked about the genocide in Bosnia, and it says, well, it was military-age males. So it doesn't say they were killed engaged in military activity. It says, well, they were mostly military-age males that were killed, as if this is a justification, which is the same justification Obama used for his drone program. You're considered an enemy killed in action, not a civilian collateral damage if you're a male between like 16 and 30 or something like this. And Chomsky says this is a good book that people should read. Like this, and this is in the 90s, like this is part of the left culture, and most people aren't even aware of this, like, I don't think on the left. I wasn't for a long time. So part of what I think we should do is bring awareness to these issues. The Families for Freedom from Syria has made a lot of these connections. Like, they're dealing with the detainees and people, civilian activists that were disappeared by the Assad regime. And they've worked with, say, Argentina was one of the most well-known examples on the left of a military dictatorship, disappearing people, dropped the helicopters. And they've built connections with them, and so I think that's a way to bring greater awareness to this and counteract the denialism and conspiracism in the growing Red-Brown alliance. And so I hope we can talk about how we can not have the same conversation a year from now.